Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I hope this message finds you well wherever you are in the world. So, if you don't mind, I'd like to take this opportunity, if I may, to give some brief comments about a particular box set that was released by Arrow Video under its Arrow Academy label some years back, and it is a set that I think is one of the best Arrow sets that I have ever come across. And while I admit that I am not the biggest Arrow expert, still I do have my share of Arrow Video and Arrow Academy releases, and this certainly has been one of the great pleasures that I've had as a physical media fan with respect to a particular release from a very well-renowned label. And the set that I am speaking of is the Arrow Academy set, which is right here. This is Kiju Yoshida, Love plus Anarchism. Filmmaker Kiju Yoshida, or sometimes referred to as Yoshige Yoshida, is a filmmaker that is well-renowned and one of the most famous and important filmmakers from the Japanese cinema scene from the 60s and 70s in particular. There are a number of his works that, in my opinion, are absolutely essential viewing for anyone who is interested in the movements and currents and evolutions and changes and tremors and fluctuations and everything of the sort that occurred in terms of Japanese cinema, and in particular Japanese cinema of a certain type of art theater type of cinema, or avant-garde cinema, from the 1960s and 1970s. And in particular, my friends, the period of films that Yoshida made from the late 1960s to the early 1970s, and they are included in this set from Arrow Academy, which is an absolutely mind-blowing, knock one's socks off type of set. This is a DVD and Blu-ray dual format set, which is one that has 3 discs in it, and I've pulled them out of the box here. So there are 3 films that are included in this set, and the first is Eros plus Massacre, and the next film is Heroic Purgatory, and the last film is called Coup d'etat. So there are these 3 films, and with respect to the first film that I mentioned, Eros plus Massacre, this set contains 2 versions of this film, what's known as the theatrical version of the film, and then what was later known or later released as a kind of director's cut version of the film. And the director's cut version is quite long. So the theatrical version runs 164 minutes, and the director's cut runs approximately 215 minutes. So there is a significant elongation of the running time when you get from the theatrical cut to the director's cut of the film Eros versus Massacre. So those are what comprise of the first 2 discs, which is the 2 versions of Eros plus Massacre. And then on the 3rd disc we have the 2 other films that are included in the set, which are Heroic Purgatory and Coup d'etat. And then we have also a booklet which contains a number of really top-notch, essential essay readings for anyone who is interested in the works of Yoshida, the concerns of Yoshida, in particular in respect of these particular films, these three films, which I would understand if people feel that they are somewhat challenging and enigmatic and somewhat difficult to grasp, because I think the subject matter is, at least on the surface, potentially quite challenging. So having some essays in this booklet, I think, are quite helpful. And also there is a great essay and great discussion about how this film, or how these films play in the landscape of the independent art house circuit and filmmaking aesthetic from the late 60s and early 70s. Sometimes people mention the phrase Art Theater Guild, or ATG. Well, these films more or less have strong connections with the so-called ATG movement in Japan, and some films more than others, of course, but there are strong connections with these films and with Yoshida and the movement itself. And so to have the essays in this book talking about these various aspects of these films and Yoshida, the director, and also ATG and other aspects of Japanese cinema at the time, and also the historic and political considerations that Yoshida is concerned with when he's making these films. Having that background presented, first of all, in these essays, I think is really quite extraordinary. So we have, just for your information, we have the essay by David Desser, the great David Desser, called Yoshida, A Career. And then we have another essay called The Revolutionary Triptych, which is by Isolde Standish. And then we have Kiju Yoshida and ATG, The Reluctant Partner, by Dick Stegewarns. So we have these three essays, each dealing with a various or different aspect of Yoshida, his career, or these films in particular, the political concerns, the artistic concerns, and also Yoshida, these films, and ATG, and by extension, the Japanese filmmaking movement of the time, the late 60s and early 70s. So already in this set, we have these wonderful essays which provide some of the great sort of introductory writings with respect to Yoshida and his career. So if anyone who is coming to these films fresh and not knowing much about Yoshida and his concerns with respect to these films, I would suggest reading these essays once you've watched the films, and really going through them with care, because they are truly among the best essays that I've come across with any sort of Blu-ray release. So this is a wonderful thing to have with respect to this set. And so if you're able to get this set with this booklet included, then I would strongly urge you to do so, as long as it's offered at a reasonable price, of course. But that's the booklet. But what about the films themselves and what they mean and what they are consisting of? Well, my friends, what I will plan to do is, I think because each of these films is quite intense, and each of them, all of them, are in their own respective ways absolutely amazing. They are amazing, they are vital, they are important, they are essential for anyone who is interested in pursuing a kind of journey through the landscape of Japanese cinema, especially the landscape of Japanese cinema from the late 60s and early 70s. If you're interested in watching the films from that era, and in particular films that were of a kind of avant-garde philosophy and approach that wasn't necessarily studio-bound, then you will find much to love in all of these films. I promise you, you will find much love in all of these films. And so that is my roundabout way of saying, even if you are unable to get this set, then my hope is that you will try to find these films if they are able to be seen, for instance, in some kind of streaming service, It may be in a DVD somewhere or some other means by which one can see these films. I would strongly urge that you check them out, especially if you are interested in a kind of poetic yet very direct and striking and oftentimes shocking view of certain aspects of Japanese history and political concerns, and the political concerns of Japan during the 50s and 60s that gave rise to a kind of revolutionary spirit among Japanese students, and in particular the left, the ideological left, the political ideological left, and how that came against, or how that was at odds with a sort of political establishment that was growing ever since the end of the war and the end of the post-war occupation, and the beginning of a sort of economic or establishment of certain foundations, government and societal foundations that would lead to a kind of economic boom, but also that would have political implications in terms of U.S.-Japan relations, in terms of the rise of communism, and also in terms of the role of Japan in terms of its economy, and also in terms of dealing and grappling with its past, and amongst all that, trying to deal with some kind of sense of identity and who one is, both as a nation and also as an individual. And I think more fundamentally as an individual, because these films are not dealing with those questions, at least most of them anyway. They aren't necessarily dealing with those questions on a sort of macro level in terms of looking at the lens of looking at Japan through the lens of the cinema necessarily, but I would argue that there is a much more personal approach to these films, that in terms of the effects on the individual, in terms of these sweeping changes, and also in terms of how alienating that might feel, in terms of how history might not necessarily be the be-all end-all of truth, where we are subject to interpretation, we are subject to change, and also history is subject to change, and how that affects our psyche and how that affects our ability to communicate with other people and with ourselves. And I think with that very general approach, I think one can take away the possibilities anyway that these films present an opportunity to, even if one doesn't have a full understanding of Japanese history, even if one doesn't understand, for instance, the implications of Taisho era and the Kanto earthquake of 23, or maybe important points in Japanese history, for instance, 1952, or the implications of 1960 and 1970, etc. Even if one doesn't necessarily have those details under one's belt, still there is much to gain from watching these films, I would argue. That's not to say that, I mean, of course, having information under one's belt about Japanese history, the relevant strands of Japanese history, I think would be, of course, potentially making these films very rewarding as watches. But even if you don't have that foundation, my friends, I think there's much to gain from watching these films. And so I would strongly urge anyone who is interested to, and if you can find these films with relative ease, or without necessarily breaking the bank, then I would strongly suggest that at the very least you try to find them and take a look, because they are really among the most fascinating and stimulating works from this period of Japanese cinema, at least in my opinion. And so I've never spoken about them before, and I don't necessarily want to talk about all of them in one group, because I think each of them is very, very different from the rest. And so what I'll do going forward, if you don't mind, is I will talk about these films in their own separate videos. And so that means in upcoming videos, I'm not sure exactly when, but I'll try to do it as soon as possible. But in upcoming videos, I will talk about the film Eros plus Massacre, which is called in Japanese Eros plus Gyakusatsu. And I will talk about this in terms of the theatrical version that we have on this disc, and also we have the director's cut version, which we have on the separate disc. And each disc has its own set of supplements, and so I'll try to go into my views of the supplements as well as my views of the films in general in a separate video. And then we have on the third disc, we have the two remaining films. So we have the film Heroic Purgatory, or Rengoku Eroica, and then we have also on the same disc, or the same case, as it were, Coup d'etat, Kai Genrei. And so these two films are equally as important, and they have different approaches, but they are each their own quite enthralling and oftentimes difficult, and so challenging and so rewarding in their own ways. And so I do want to devote a separate video to each of these films. So one video for Heroic Purgatory, and then one video for Coup d'etat. So if you don't mind, because I think this is really worth talking about. And so with that, my friends, this is maybe a kind of introduction or a little sneak preview as to what I will be talking about in upcoming videos with respect to this set. Now, I've been asked by a number of people about other Arrow sets that are Japanese film releases that are maybe from the same or similar era as the Yoshida box set. And so perhaps this might be the opportunity for me to try to inaugurate something here on this YouTube channel with respect to perhaps trying to talk a little bit more about those other sets as well, the Akioji Soji set, or maybe the Seijun Suzuki Taisho trilogy set, or something like that. And so I would love the opportunity to do so if I can. And if that's the case, then please let me, if you don't mind, start with what I think is one of the best sets that I've ever come across from Arrow Video, from any label for that matter, which is this set, the Kiju Yoshida Love plus Anarchism set, which contains the 3 films plus supplements and the book of the 3 films being Eros plus Massacre, the 2 versions, the theatrical version and the director's cut version, and then the film Heroic Purgatory, and then the film Coup d'etat. So Eros plus Massacre, Heroic Purgatory, and Coup d'etat. These films are massive. They are massive. They are incredibly important. They are really difficult, or seemingly so, but I would actually suggest that they aren't as difficult as they might seem. Even the film Heroic Purgatory, which I will get to, which has been touted as being among the most difficult films of Yoshida's canon, as well as being one of the most difficult films of this particular era. And on the one hand, while I would agree to some extent with that assessment, on the other hand, I would actually suggest that even a film like Heroic Purgatory is very approachable, and it has a certain kind of rhythm and cadence to it that I think allows oneself to become involved in the film quite remarkably. And so hopefully I'll try to get into that in some later video, at least my view of how I think this film can operate. I think it's subject to many interpretations, and it's actually it's still admittedly a very difficult film. I'm not suggesting that Heroic Purgatory is an easy film. It's by no means an easy film. It's a very difficult film, but I think there is a way in which the film can still feel somewhat accessible, even though it still obviously is presenting very difficult scenarios. That being said, I think it does present itself also as being a potentially accessible watch. And so even a film like Heroic Purgatory is one that I'd love to talk about. Incidentally, I love these films very much. I mean, they're very shocking and difficult sometimes, but I truly adore them. I mean, I was speaking about Heroic Purgatory, and I cannot get enough of the film Heroic Purgatory, for an example. I'm every time I watch that film, I'm just floored, and I'm just so impressed with the grace and beauty and intellectual dynamism and the sheer force of will that Yoshida is able to present to us as film viewers, as spectators. And you go from there to a film like Coup d'etat, which presents a kind of similar philosophy, and yet there are things about it that I think have a very similar aesthetic, but also there are things that are itself quite unique to that particular film. It's such a powerful work. And then, of course, we go back to one of the great masterpieces of this era from the late 60s, which is Eros plus Massacre, Eros plus Gyakusatsu, which is, as I say, it's a masterpiece, and it's one that I think every person who seeks to know more about Japanese cinema should watch. It really is that important, I think, and it's important for a number of reasons. I think there are many things that converge in that film. There are many strands of history, and also sort of political philosophy, and also the production history of Japanese cinema, and also the craft of filmmaking, Yoshida's filmmaking craft itself, sort of the acting prowess. Mariko Okada, of course, is figures in so prominently in all these films, and so she is obviously a very influential and powerful artistic force in Yoshida's work, of course, for many reasons. But that is just scratching the surface of a kind of supreme work of enthralling art and beauty that is also very shocking and very provocative. So that is the film Eros plus Massacre. The two versions that you get in the set, by the way, are stellar. I mean, there's a theatrical version, 2 hours plus a theatrical version, still quite long, and then you have the longer director's cut, which is over 3 hours. And so you have the shorter theatrical cut. So some might think that the theatrical cut being shorter is maybe inferior to the director's cut. And in some ways I would agree with that. But in other ways I would say that it's good to have both versions of Eros plus Massacre, because while the longer director's cut is, I think, considered by many, myself included, to be the kind of the definitive version of the film, the theatrical cut, the shorter theatrical version, is still very valuable, and it has a lot of merits and advantages. And in fact, I would say that there are some aspects of the theatrical version of the film Eros plus Massacre that I think work very well, and arguably much better than some aspects of the director's cut version of Eros plus Massacre. And so these are just some things that I'll try to talk about in future videos going forward. But I do want to say that I want to thank everyone who has, over the course of the last several months or so, ever since I've done this YouTube channel, I've had a number of people who've been asking me about doing some videos on the Kiju Yoshida box set and maybe some other Aero Academy sets of a similar vein. And so I've always wanted to do this. I've always wanted to do this, but it's just never presented itself. But I think now is as good a time as any, I suppose, because these films I really believe are so important and so worth watching. The works of Yoshida are incredibly important, and in particular we have these three works, Eros plus Massacre, and Heroic Purgatory, and Coup d'etat. So these three works, and Eros plus Massacre has the theatrical version and the director's cut. So in essence, you're getting 4 films in this box set. And so if you can get the set without necessarily having to spend too much, then I would strongly urge you to do so. If you have the set already, but you haven't yet opened it or watched it, I would, if you're interested in watching films that are really, really important and so fundamentally a part of the sort of Japanese new wave scene, the Japanese art house scene, the Japanese independent cinema movement scene, the Japanese avant-garde film movement of the late 1960s and 70s, etc. And if you're interested in watching what are arguably among the most important films from one of the most important filmmakers from Japanese cinema from that era, then please open up the set and please watch the films as soon as you can, because you are in for a treat. There's a lot to consume here. There's a lot to ponder here. There's a lot to consider here, and these are the sorts of films that I think are so worth watching over and over and over and over again if you have the opportunity, because they really yield so much treasure and so many rewards upon rewatch and rewatch. The mysteries of initial viewings give way to a kind of flowering of beauty and appreciation, which then lead to more questions and more mysteries that hopefully will create even of a more deeper, enriching, rewarding experience with these films as you watch them and rewatch them. Which is, of course, what I hope happens, because these films deserve as much attention as they can get. So once again, my friends, the films in question are Eros plus Massacre, Heroic Purgatory, and Coup d'etat. Okay. And they are in this Arrow set. This is the limited edition set of Kiju Yoshida, Love plus Anarchism. So, my friends, I will try going forward to talk more about these films in detail, starting with Eros plus Massacre. So please stay tuned to this channel if you are interested. It would be my pleasure to talk with you more about these truly staggering works of art. And I would love to hear your thoughts and comments about them along the way. So, my friends, thank you very much. Once again, thank you very much for those of you who have encouraged me over these past months or so to try to talk more about these films in detail. And thanks to your encouragement, now I will be doing so. So thank you once again, my friends, and please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great, great movies. So until we meet again, please take good care of yourselves, and cheers.